I want to tell you about stories, about pens and swords and the people and communities who wield them. It's kind of difficult for me to tell this story because there are so many like it. This story about stories has been told by many voices, some maybe more experienced or knowledgeable than mine. But, and I think this is key, there's something maybe to be learned in each new telling, in each reinterpretation or reframing of a story. In his Massey lecture, The Truth About Stories, the author Thomas King begins with a quote from the Okanagan storyteller Jeanette Armstrong. She says, "I'm a listener to the language's stories, and when my words form, I'm merely retelling the same stories in different patterns. I live in a world where new songs are created from old tunes, where used clothes are cut up and repurposed into new designs, and where amateur enthusiasts hack consumer products into items of their own fashioning, more useful to their needs and desires than the original product." It seems strange to bring in old stories, these old songs of love and loneliness and longing, in a lecture series dedicated to sharing new and innovative ideas. But there's something in these old stories that keeps us turning back to them. I remember being windswept at the top of Hadrian's Wall in northern England and poking around these old Roman ruins. They were nestled amongst the muttering of tough grasses and the clamoring of lost sheep. And in the latrines, there was a panel, as there often are in these sort of ruins, that had the English translations of the original Latin graffiti that had been scrawled into the wall. And they said things like, "Lucia was here," or "For a good time, see Maximus in Baker's Lane." And I mean, it's a simple thing, but the point is worth noting that hundreds and hundreds of years later, we're still telling the same stories, as the bathroom walls at the Jimmy jails will no doubt attest. We're declaring our existence in the world, trying to make ourselves immortal by adding our voices to this song of humanity. And so, even as we discover new techniques and acquire new knowledge in science and design and art and technology, we are resamplers of culture, building hybrid identities by telling old stories in new configurations. And it is in each telling that these stories acquire power. So there are many different ways to tell this story, but this telling is mine. I've always told myself stories. I think most of us have done it at some point. It begins almost before we start remembering. We hear the trees talking, or build cities from small pebbles and sand, or drag invisible friends out of the shadows of abandoned lots. I was 8, or somewhen around that anyway, and I had some chores to do, sorting laundry into piles in my parents' basement. We lived on a residential street that had once been a swamp, and the concrete walls were always cold, and toads would occasionally congregate outside the downstairs windows, croaking hesitantly. And I was sitting there in the murky half-light sorting, a red t-shirt into the warm colors pile, a bra and a rank pair of running socks into the whites, and the weighty thump of a pair of black jeans crumpling resolutely into the darks. Yearning to be perhaps more than a tiny girl sorting her family's clothes, I wrote this spirited proletariat story for myself. Hard work, not enough pay. I even wrote a little song timed to the satisfying weighty thump of each piece of laundry. Work, work, that's all I do. And it would be easy to write this off as a game, as a conjured wool scarf into the delicates for hand-washing naturally, to ward off the chill of ennui. But it seemed more important to my small, fierce self then, and it still feels important now. It was in this narrative revisioning that the mundane became livable and drudgery became golden in this new imagined light. There are powerful things, these narratives that we tell ourselves, whether we are small or grown up and beginning to coalesce into groups of adults. And sometimes a story works within the dynamic of a community to make a proposition that stretches the bounds of what we believe is possible. I work for Musagetes, an arts organization that strives to make the arts more central and meaningful to people's lives and within our societies. And we work in 4 cities, in Guelph, in Sudbury in northern Ontario, in Lecce in the south of Italy, and in Rijeka on the coast of Croatia. And the stories that we tell through participatory and socially engaged artistic practices often take off on lives of their own within the communities that we work in. They become something new to each person who interprets or talks about or hears about an event as people make sense of what they've experienced. Between a Rock and a Hard Place was an art project that we did in Sudbury last summer, just as the nights were starting to get chilly. And it was a one-day series of punk and folk and rock, classical and electronic concerts over one 11-hour day. And a bus packed full of people etched an alternative map of the city, both physically and metaphorically, as it took the audience from site to site. The day was rich with seams of stories. One singer played an acoustic set on a piano that a small army of people had dragged to the top of a bluff earlier in the day so that she could play on it. And she played in the rain with the keys sticking in the wet to a sea of grins that was fed by the pouring rain that slicked hair to faces and soaked socks sopping throughout the day. Or a small but dedicated group of cyclists that followed the tour from site to site on their bikes. This was a one-time experience, one city, one day, and one bus. And when the bus reached the last stop and the last notes bounced back from the underbelly of the decommissioned Sudbury Water Tower, which was the site for the last event, and the last beam of pink and green light snuffed out with the last puff of the fog machine, the harmonic overtones of this incredible myth resonated within the voices of the community. What was great about this project was it drew out the oldest stories of the rocks, of the meteor impact that created the nickel seams in Sudbury and still slightly shakes the earth today. And it brought those memories in conversation with the newer histories of mining and industry and the exciting cultural energy that exists in the music scene to tell a story of what was possible in Sudbury. Now, the story was ripe with potential and critical complexity, and in an age of slogans and stereotypes and band-aid solutions, that can sometimes be a really difficult thing to do. And I would really love to tell you that all it would take is for you to pull up your socks and hold your head a bit higher and eat a bit more kale and get into your power stance and write a blog, a manifesto, a to-do list, and it'll change. But it's far more complex and emergent than that. Sometimes stories are told so many times by so many people that they become simplistic narratives that are deep ruts worn through to the bare earth of our identities. And though we might try to forge a new path by telling a new story, those ruts are very hard to avoid. We have to be insistently careful of the stories that we are telling and retelling. And sometimes these are the narratives that we tell ourselves and our communities and our societies and nationalities, like our Prime Minister's ridiculous claim that Canadians don't have a history of colonialism. And often they're the well-worried, well-scuffed paths of self-doubt and anxiety that we continually etch into our own heads. In Guelph, on a municipal level, we've built an identity around our left-wing green politics and eco-activism that has brought a provincial candidate from outside of our city here because he has a greater likelihood of being elected here. And this one telling of this story is indeed true. But these stories have a potential, if they're simplified, to sweep lived experiences of inequality and exclusion deftly under a narrative rug. And they can let us sit, rightfully so, proud of our refillable water bottles and solar heating, and let us conveniently ignore important issues of social justice within our community, such as the access to resources in Guelph suburbs, for example, or the continuously displaced people within our downtown core. And there are many who acknowledge the interconnectedness between social and environmental activism, and they grow gardens with hungry people and make our city more walkable and bikeable. But there are some who might use these stories as warm, comforting blankets that allow us to rest complacently while excluding complex historical truths. And when you're a tiny wannabe Marxist sorting laundry in your parents' basement, that fire of a story, a comforting story, can kind of make a dull situation a little bit more interesting. But when the story is used to pacify ourselves from a troubling reality, it can be incredibly problematic. So, if we want lasting change, and to move forward thoughtfully, we have to reach deep into the threads of our old stories. And this is a painful process, I know it is. There are things about ourselves that we would rather forget and bury deep in the past than take up and examine again. And there are things about our countries that we have to own, and yes, perhaps be ashamed of. But we have to stop ignoring these drop stitches within the fabric of our communities in pursuit of the superficial and comforting. And instead of discarding our uncomfortable narratives, we need to learn to sit with that discomfort and that uncertainty and that complexity and tease out the warped weft and tangled snarl of the past to weave a new pattern. Because it's in this reparative retelling that a new story can emerge, one that includes the multitude of stories and histories, both painful and beautiful, that make up ourselves and our communities. We can acknowledge our role as resamplers of culture and build hybrid patchwork identities, telling old stories in thoughtful new ways. We can choose complexity and truth and reconciliation instead of selective histories. And we can tell the stories that pick up the dropped threads and forgotten narratives to make a more honest and rich and varied cloth out of the old stories we've been telling ourselves. The resampling and reworking of the story that can change everything.